Welcome, everyone. I'm Matt Kohler, and this is the Computational Social Science Society of the Americas bi-monthly webinar. Today, we're joined by Professor Paul Brenner. He is the Senior Associate Director of the University of Notre Dame Center for Research Computing and the Associate Professor of the Practice and, I forgot to ask what IMA stands for, to the U.S. Air Force's headquarters component that handles training, specifically the Air Education Training Command. And he works with their CIO. He manages all kinds of different projects and people. And we're very excited about his talk today on some interesting NLP, natural language processing techniques and things. And before I turn things over to you completely, what does IMA stand for?
So, and we can go later for all the crazy monikers and acronyms for the military, but since I'm a reserve officer, when we're attached to an active duty person, so I'm attached to the CIO, I'm an individual mobilization augmentee. So effectively, when the active duty person has to, get pulled away, I mobilize and slide in as the military officer when he's out of pocket. So I am the reservist attached to him, and when he's gone, I take over as the CIO for the Air Education and Training Command.
Okay, oh, that is fascinating. So just the way these things typically work, please do ask questions, but put them in the chat. The chat will be monitored, and we'll make sure they get asked. If you have a point of clarification during the talk itself, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. But if they're just general questions and things like that, please put them in the chat and we'll ask them towards the end. There will be time for questions at the end. We do tend to record we do record them, and then with the speaker's permission, we will post them to YouTube, just FYI. So thank you everyone for joining, and I'm going to turn things over to Paul.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Matt. Well, first of all, thanks to everyone, especially those in highly dispersed time zones, if it's super early or if it's late in your evening, especially for those super early on the West Coast who may not have slept at all. I imagine, as computational social scientists, the anxiety and interest simultaneous with what's been going on in the U.S. for the election season, culminating last night and still extending into the coming days. So for those who haven't slept, those who are up at 7 a.m. or other wild hours this morning, thank you for your time. This is, as always, an interesting, challenging, and unprecedented time. And what better reason to, continue to further computational social science and try and help better understand our society. So thank you for everybody that made time in this sleepless time in our careers and our lives right now. So we will dive right in. So I am Paul Brenner, as introduced. I'm the Senior Associate Director of the Center for Research Computing. So what that means is effectively I'm a full-time research faculty member, and I run the day-to-day operations of our center. And I'll talk a little bit kind of at a high level so that gives you a frame of context for where I'm coming from in that. I'm a computer scientist by trade. And I work a lot, every single day across the domains of faculty at the university, bringing computational science tools to their specific domains. And so today we'll be talking about multiple projects actually in the social sciences for the application of NLP, and one in specific that more recently we've been putting a lot of effort, and that's event classification, specifically from large numbers of news articles so that we can do statistical analysis and look for causality beyond general correlation for a number of causes. And specifically, we'll be talking in the areas of violence and mass killing. So that'll be the primary focus as we kind of culminate at the end. But I'm going to use the first few slides to kind of give a background of the CRC, NLP, and machine learning in general, and then we'll roll into a number of the social science applications. As always, I would be remiss if I didn't thank a number of the students, as I'll be referencing work that they've been diligently touching upon, and I reference each of them on the slides for which they put key work, but a number there that you can see. So this is Paul Brenner's team with a lot of very bright and hardworking students. So let's see if I can forward. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the CRC briefly. For those, within this association, we've had sort of a couple of camps. Some of us have kind of bridged them. Some of us have kind of been a little standoffish. So I'm going to talk a little bit about machine learning, differing than some of the agent-based modeling and other tools that have been used. So for those that are experts in that, it won't be that long, and hopefully it's not too far off from the quick 2-minute summary that you would also give. For those who haven't done it, hopefully that gives you a little bit of foundation that when we jump right into natural language processing, you see where that's pulling out some of those foundations from machine learning. And then I'll go heavy into the applications for the rest of the talk on very specific research projects that we've been focused on. So this is the Center for Research Computing. I'm hanging out somewhere there kind of in the top middle. So the HPC team, our software engineering team, security, then we additionally have a number of computational scientists, each with specific domains, everything from web frameworks to computational biology to ontologies. We also have recently started up a forensics, cybercrime investigations research and education. You see, so that one's brand new and a growth area there. Somewhat, in the Venn diagram, there's some social science related to cybersecurity, and then there's forensics. And so some intersection there. So we see some computational social scientists partnering in the forensic side as we move forward. In fact, it's in partnership with our College of Arts and Letters and led primarily by faculty in psychology and sociology, and we bring the computational component to that. Then our Center for Social Science, Notre Dame also just received a large $20 million donation, and we're starting an institute for data and society, and we'll be integrating a number of our projects with that new institute as we grow. So that's sort of the background. You see, when we talk about computational social science or computational sciences in general, this is the breadth. So our center supports them, bringing the computer science expertise and then unique expertise with some of our computational scientists in those specific domains. One last here to kind of get an idea of what does that mean, right? Okay, you've got all these people, what do they actually do? And so some are down all the way at the hardware level. So those would be our HPC. And so they're helping make sure you've got the right GPUs or the right FPGAs. Are we using cloud? Are we doing on-premises? Do we have the Internet of Things? That's not necessarily a buzzword anymore. It's, do I have the right sensors? Do I have the right data ingest? How do I do that? So we'll help them design and architect that. Bunch of middleware, right? The orchestration over time, when we used to do this via sort of grid and then cloud computing, and now the hotness that everybody wants is container orchestration and Kubernetes or something else. We do a bunch of middleware, the actual simulations themselves, the cornerstone of what we're doing in the computational, helping them write that software. And then how do we interface ultimately with that data as we design these portals and gateways? So that's sort of the stack that we help people design and look through all of those particular levels of infrastructure. And you'll see a little bit of that when I talk about some of the projects we're doing in the NLP, so that we can get all the way up from the GPU all the way to, how are we kind of interfacing and doing data visualization. We can talk more as questions arise, as people have interest in that regards. Okay, so that was a 2 minutes of how our center works and how this relates to computational social science. I'm going to do an equally sort of tour de force here on the machine learning and how that branches us into NLP very quickly. So a lot of methods, right? So the statisticians versus the computer scientists, and hopefully the hybrid between them, and then all the domain experts, right, that are kind of a hybrid. You're a statistical biologist, or you're a statistical sociologist, or computational psychologist, right? So all of these blends, when we look back to kind of machine learning and the core, and as a computer scientist, I will give it over to my applied mathematicians. To me, machine learning really at the core is applied math. Now that, again, hopefully is not too much zealot or blasphemy for anybody here that, is from one of the other camps, but I will hand it as a computer scientist to the applied mathematicians. A number of my students are either doing dual degrees or some of them are straight from the applied math department. And so I found that just this core from the machine learning side of things. So a breadth. There's been a big push in recent years, right? But neural networks aren't brand new. AI is not new. We've got decades that we've been working on this, but there has been this big explosion in sort of the deep neural networks, the transformers, those sorts of things that as the data sizes have got bigger, as our computational capabilities gotten bigger, and as some of the algorithms we've been able to sort of evolve, stack them, the accuracy is going up in significant ways that has opened up a lot of new doors. So you ride the hype curve a little bit as these things come and go, but there definitely has been with some of these advances in the application of some traditional technologies, but kind of in new ways with greater data and greater computation that we are seeing a lot of promise, right? And sometimes for our, and myself on previous papers as an agent-based modeler, I'm a little biased in saying, okay, but you're just kind of doing these random correlations. You don't understand the black box of machine learning. Let's actually get to the theory and build models, et cetera. But I think there's certainly a place for both. And we've been balancing that in my lab, in the center, at the university, in this, we're simulation based on theory, or we're actually doing machine learning to help us look for correlations that help advise theory, right? So there's some cyclical loop. There's some camps there, but certainly I have learned a lot, and it's broadened my horizon in the past 5 years or so, kind of revisiting a number of these tools. And again, some of these tools, as you look at it here, supervised, semi-supervised, and the unsupervised, I mean, these are not necessarily new, right? PCA and random forest and naive Bayes. These have been around, but we're finding new ways to apply them, and especially in the neural networks and the transformers. Primarily today, and I'll explain why, in the NLP space, I'm going to talk mostly about support vector machines. And some of you might be like, oh, that's old school. But I think there's a lot of, sometimes we went to the shiny new toys in the transformers and neural nets. And for the big data sets, I think there's a lot of application there. But I think in the social science, if we don't have a lot of labeled training data, I think there's still opportunities to really understand how some of these other tools, especially on smaller training test sets, can be very helpful. And I'll talk more about why we chose some of the work we're doing with support vector machines. We recognize there's a lot of when the hotness is on transformers, and BERT and the rest of those tools, there's certainly, you have to, appreciate that. And so we're actually in the lab doing tests right now so we can do one-to-one comparisons in all cases, why we're using these different tools. But for us right now, we've seen the highest kind of, accuracy and understanding when we've been doing some more SVMs versus the other tools. But we can finish up with some discussions on that. And I'd love to get people's thoughts in that regard. A couple of things, right, that we need to, as we go into the NLP, that I always like to talk with folks about, that either they're super knowledgeable and they're saying, hey, Paul, have you thought about these 4 things? Make sure, or things that if you've not been doing machine learning that you need to kind of be aware of that is in the background of our mind, right? And so they always talk, right, in machine learning is we're going to be talking about accuracy and overfitting and underfitting, which is kind of also related, right, and kind of the trade-off in bias versus variance trade-off, right? So I'm going to be reporting and talking to you later about accuracy of these various NLP tools for doing classification, but accuracy is always a number that's somewhat malleable, right? So I can change my training set in some regards, and that will affect my accuracy, right? So if my training set is overfit, right, then I'm going to get higher numbers, but it will be less applicable to a broad number of social science phenomena or to a broader definition. When I talk about event classification, that event has to be defined, right? And so if I overfit on a definition, then anything outside, even just a couple of words off, may not be properly classified. If it's within that, awesome, I'm going to classify it 90+%, but maybe my definition wasn't great and I'm going to be missing something, right? So overfitting, underfitting, always something that we have to think about when we're talking about, accuracy of classification using machine learning. Some of the domain lens, I talked about this previously just because it always comes up, sort of the statistics versus, computational science, the R crowd versus the Python crowd. Some divergence in terminology as we kind of get away from sort of that core. And I would lean back. I'm trying to do a better job of giving precedence to the decades of work in statistics versus some of the buzzword tools. Now, I will admit most of my students and I all work in Python because we come from the computer science background, but I do have a couple that are R-based. So for any of the R folks out there, I give you props. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in the R community environment for the toolsmithing for NLP and machine learning. The third there, inductive bias. This is, in some regards, not necessarily specific to machine learning, right? This is also for those of us who have done agent-based models. As we model, as we're already thinking about what we want to see the outcome, right, this inductive bias that our model is pre-composed to give us the output that we were already looking for. And this is something as scientists we always have, but it also applies in machine learning such that as we give definitions and training sets, et cetera, that they're designed, the training set and the definitions of the classifications to ultimately come with the discovery that we were looking for, which we know we have to be careful with, right? Unfortunately, a lot in society, especially as I work with corporate partners, that's not always the case, right? They're funded to come with a certain output, and that's the profitable one. And that's not necessarily, I'm not beating on the profitable, right? That's just, you have to understand where the driver is there in the bias. Profits can mean sustainability of good science, right? So, but there's the inductive bias. Machine learning does not escape that. And then the no free lunch. Optimal optimizations a priori. There's a lot of people trying to tune hyperparameters for NLP and machine learning. But when you're looking at really big data where the optimization hasn't been able to be statistically calculated, that you're not going to be able to get a truly optimal optimization. But for those that have not seen these four, look them up. If you're doing a cocktail party and you want to talk machine learning, you can have these questions to ask. Hey, what do you think about this or that? For those that know this cold, great. Shoot me an email if there's a couple of things when I talk this with other people, and I can tweak this slide so that we get the community all on the same page on some of these key sort of machine learning notes that should be in all of our minds. So, okay. I think we're about ready to move into NLP. So try to cover some basics so the rest of the talk makes sense, but I'll pause for a second, if anybody has any shout outs, and otherwise we'll press on. Okay. All right, so now we're going to get into NLP. So subset of machine learning. Again, that might hurt somebody's feelings. I'm always, you in all talks where you're talking broadly to a broader audience, you're kind of walking through a minefield. I consider it kind of a subset of machine learning. The linguistics folks would get upset, right? They've been doing linguistics, for decades without it. So some sort of a balance there. In my application of it, I use it as a machine learning tool specifically applied to text. But there's certainly wealths and decades of experts in linguistics that have been doing things before they were, readily using SVMs. And so there's a whole breadth there. In fact, so those who have done event classification from a more semantic basis, there's a whole field of research there. In fact, we started out on one of our projects using a tool called Petrarch, and one of the lead developers and authors, so Phil Schroet, was super helpful, gave us some guidance, and ultimately said, I think for your application, and I always love when a senior, expert in the field says, look, even though my tool's cool, I think this application might be better for something like, an SVM or a neural network. So thanks to his guidance a year and a half ago, we've been able to make a lot more rapid progress because this just happened to be a better fit for some of the machine learning tools. But certainly in NLP, there's also sort of the semantic analysis. It's a kind of a forked structured analysis that's not machine learning based in the same way. But I'm going to talk specifically machine learning. For those who broadly want to more talk NLP, obviously there's a very diverse set there. So, for those who are like, okay, how is this relevant? If you're trying to, again, cocktail party or explain to your family or friends why NLP is cool in our society, right? So they get now sort of, hopefully some of these icons mean something to you. So they can be as far back as we started seeing the very first simple sort of word clouds, and that is natural language processing. We're learning something about the language, right? To our more advanced tools sort of front and center there, talking to our Google Assistant, or we're talking to Siri or Alexa, right? How are they? And we'll talk a little bit about signal processing and language translation, but in the portfolio, these are these assistance tools. Obviously, the chatbots that are growing rapidly. A lot of these assistants pop up. They don't necessarily, when you're on the website, say, I am a chatbot. But for those now that are getting more used to it, right, you ask about 5 questions. If it doesn't have your answer, there's a pause where it may hand you off to a real human being. But almost in every regard, you're starting out with NLP and chatbots. And that seems to be a continued growing field as they get more mature. And they want these inference engines. We'll talk about that, right? This engine that is digesting, classifying, categorizing what you type in, right, so that it can give you a suggestion. And obviously, this expands not just in chat for service portals, but all of the work that's being done, obviously doing mining and social media and sentiment analysis are also part of the NLP portfolio. Obviously, like on the far left there, we talk about NLP for, just part of speech completion, right? Figuring out what the next word is. Do we understand, in the language, what we think that person's going to say? Translation is a huge one there to the left. And then I put just sort of let me go back one. So I'm trying to move my Zoom pictures of everybody. Top right up there is, IBM's cloud and the Watson sort of, background. One of the earliest NLP in the digital IT world as far as mass was, email filters for your spam. So it would try to look at words, understand enough of them, classify, categorize. So NLP has been around for a long time. The excitement around NLP, at least for me and my students, is the accuracy grows, as the data becomes more available, the number of additional discoveries we can make, right? So that's where the real excitement for me as a researcher is applying this to answering domain-specific questions and in coming what otherwise might have previously been notional or qualitative, and coming up with quantitative ways, because we can look at more data, we can classify more events with statistical windows and standard deviations and error bars to actually come up with more causality that maybe we didn't have in the past. There's a lot of cool also correlational work where they say, look, we found this correlation, we went through massive amounts of data, now you can look deeper and see if there's causality. But we're getting to the point now that if we develop these right, we can actually find the causality itself while we're kind of sweeping through. Bottom right there, for those of you trying to figure out exactly how much NLP is going on in Sesame Street, I will throw it out there because one or two of you may be absolute NLP experts. Does anyone know why I threw, and this will get you into an NLP, at least foot in the door at a cocktail party, what the bottom graphic there is about? I'm going to pause for a second here, classroom style, and see if anyone wants to drop it in or unmute and tell me what that's for. No guesses. I can't see the chat, Matt. Are there any guesses in the chat?
There's a guess about it being a reference to Bert.
All right. I'll give you half credit, whoever gave that particular reference. So you will get half credit. So in somewhere along the lines, in all things sort of domain and software development, they've started naming all of the tools after either primary or lesser known Sesame Street characters. So there are tools out there. There is Bert, there is Elmo, there's an Abby out there. there's different variations play on Big Bird. There's one that's trying to, you know, play their name. So that's the sort of that's the inner circle fun. If you can figure out an acronym or at least a site in a couple of different words, somehow Sesame Street, especially in your talk, that's going to get, now I haven't seen as much. Every once in a while in an abstract, I see a couple words like those that are really trying to sneak it in there. But the Sesame Street is the background for NLP in recent years. So if you're going to name a tool, if you're going to write a paper, you might do a couple of quick, think back 20 years, 30 years on a couple of your favorite Sesame Street characters and figure out how to weave those in. But yes, that's the fun inner circle of NLP, is figuring out how it might potentially tie to Sesame Street. So you'll see a lot of tools that way. And you'll notice they're spelled in weird ways and realize they're trying to tie something to a Sesame Street character. So there's your inner circle NLP for the day. Okay. A little less on the application, a little more as far as where, function is. And this one is absolutely adapted, almost full snag from Bill McCartney, who I believe originally started at Stanford, bounced around, and now is doing a bunch of NLP stuff for Apple. So full shout out to him for this particular layout of these applications. So you see that the Holy Grail, and NVIDIA has been pushing hard in the past year or so. So for those who aren't aware, NVIDIA is the #1 GPU producer for machine learning in the world. There's others out there, but they're the kingpin right now. And so the CEO was I was at a talk where he was a year ago, and he said, look, we've gotten really good at image recognition as a society, et cetera. There's still work to be done, but we've come a long way. In image recognition, we kind of know what we're doing, right, in production. The real next challenge is NLU. So NLU differing a little bit from NLP, where, sort of this classification, categorization, et cetera, parts of speech, we've been doing that for a while, but real NLU, natural language understanding. And so my talk's not on NLU because we're really doing more NLP, sort of applying NLP, but the Holy Grail, they do so sentiment analysis in NLU. We do rudimentary. I wouldn't put us full on understanding. My work with students, we found that sentiment analysis for anything more complex than about 5 words or a single sentence sort of starts to fall down. But there's work going there, right? That's the real research. That's the cusp. We can start doing natural language understanding. And that's the exciting part, right? If we can do natural language understanding, doing things more than a single sentence, starting to really understand paragraphs or, pages or full scientific papers, that's where I get really excited, and talking about the students saying, okay, we have license, we're at a university or somewhere where we can go through all of the journal papers for the past 60 years, all of massive amounts, building on the shoulders of giant sort of opportunities. The tools are still limited, right? We're a long way there, but in the next 10, 20 years, and that's in the research cusp of things, that's where it's getting really exciting, right? And so trying to get NLU going, and again, baby steps. I'm going to talk to you about some baby steps in the projects now that we've been working on that are more on the NLP side. But the NLU is kind of going to that Holy Grail of things that I think is really, once we get there, I don't like necessarily a bunch of superlatives, but I do think there's a potential for some golden age sort of, explosion of understanding if we can get NLU working effectively and then rolling through literature from decades or centuries of work and really looking for some of those causal, realities. Okay, so we're going to transition now. I can click in the right place on my screen to some research specific examples. So these are Paul Brenner's lab, a couple. So talk about sentiment analysis first, just sort of briefly, so that then we can spend the rest of the time on the event classification in more depth. So I'm going to talk about a paper that we just submitted looking at sentiment analysis in Arabic. One of my students that's a Arabic and applied math double major. I'll mention the global news work, sentiment analysis. I actually presented that at CSSSA conference in October last year while we were still traveling. But for those who weren't available, I'll do, I think, one slide just to talk about what we were doing there. And if any of these, longer term people, feel free to go ahead, shoot me an email, and I can send you drafts of the papers or more information on the particular projects, since this is just going to be kind of a high overview. And then I'll finish the last two things there, the text preprocessing and NLP classification. Both of those are specific to the applications of the event classification work that we've been doing in a new project for identifying triggers of mass killings. All right, so the first one, and this is the one that was presented last time we were all in person in Santa Fe, was this global sentiment analysis. And in this particular project, what we're trying to understand is for the same world events that we thought had some sort of international impact, how did different global news sources report on it? And what was the sentiment? Were they generally positive or were they generally negative about those specific activities? And so what we can see here as we look at the graphs here as we're going through, so this one happened to be, and I have to, move my Zoom thing again so I can get for everybody else here. You see the graph on the left shows you the particular news outlets that we were looking for. And we tried to look for a global distribution of news outlets. We had access to full text. So this is one of the challenges. If you're out scraping and you're looking for news, the unlicensed usually gets you either just title or a very short abstract. And the abstract alone, we could have done sentiment analysis. But we were interested in looking at sort of full text and the limits of sentiment analysis on broader amounts of text. And so in the paper, you can see where we did it on a paragraph base, on a full paper base, or averages of sentences. So we looked at it a lot of different ways. And you can see where the limits are as you go sentiment analysis on broader and broader. So saying, what is the sentiment of a news article? It gets more challenging for the tools to do that effectively. If you can sort of say, well, take the sentiment of a sentence and then average all the sentiment values of all the sentences, that actually works a little bit better as far as kind of, benchmarking versus trying to get, but that can also miss, right? Because you can have a couple of sentences that are negated 5 sentences later, but you weren't able to keep, string those together because you're doing sentence by sentence averaging. So again, there's a number of challenges and limits that come to this, but this is where we want to push the envelope and see what can we understand from a social science standpoint as far as how we understand data, how socially we absorb data. And so we looked at, what was it? I think it was 12. We worked around 10 effectively, but we had a couple extra ones, but about 10 world events over a similar number of years. And then we also tried to do about, 10 global news sources. Its own English version so that we weren't just running it through Google Translate or something like that. So we wanted the news source to provide its own English. So, so if you look for the Chinese and the Russian sources, et cetera, Al Jazeera, Times of India, all of those were provided in English by the media source themselves. We didn't run their content through a translator. So that was how they felt it was appropriately translated into English. And so then we could look and understand better. So this particular one that's up in front of you was for the articles on the nuclear disaster in Fukushima. And so fortunately, we were actually generally, as a human being, good to know that the results were not, for at least these major news sources, not as skewed as we would have been concerned, that different countries totally reported to their populations differently in terms of sentiment about these things. But a number of the big ones were, so this one was sort of, okay, generally the articles had a negative slant or a negative sentiment when they were talking about a nuclear disaster. Good, right? So that's generally, we're happy with that. We know where there's world tensions. We were glad to see that, Xinhua was not super happy, right? Even their articles were not, slightly positive or et cetera. Now, obviously you could dig really deep in these particular articles and say, well, they weren't happy, but they were still angry at the Japanese or that sort of a thing. But in general, the sentiment was negative across the board for nuclear disasters. So there's still some basis of sanity on the globe. And I say that more as a healing comment, not necessarily as a scientist, because maybe, again, this bias, is this what we were looking for that they're saying? I can tell you, I was expecting something different across the 10 different. So we looked at, events relative to Saddam Hussein's execution. We looked at President Trump's first election, President Obama's election. What did the world think about that? So we looked at a lot of things that we thought would have not just Western, but then also some global effects. Anyway, we have this paper, but if folks would like, I'm happy to forward this to you. So this was one of the works, in a quick summary for NLP and where we're going with it. Again, I'd love it to get to the point where it can really do robust article analysis. That's the NLU. But there are some things we can already pull. I think we looked at over 10,000 articles. That's the other beauty, right? Usually I get pulled in and working with a lot of our domain scientists. They'll talk about the triggers of mass killings in depth. That's with a peace studies and political science professor at the University of Notre Dame who was already doing this and just realized the volume was just way more than students would ever be able to physically read. And so it's that partnership. You need human beings that are experts reading. You need to train the computer systems. You need to cross-validate over and over and over again. But those things, ultimately have been bringing quite a bit of insight to the floor. So, all right. I'll try and speed up here just a little so I can spend the last 10 minutes or so and then still leave a little bit of time for questions on the mass killing. So this is the one on Arabic. Specifically, we're looking at dialects. There's a bunch of tools out there for Arabic sentiment analysis, not as advanced as you might expect from Latin languages, specifically English and other related, Latin-based language or the Romance languages. Those tools are more developed. I would say even the Mandarin tools are more developed. So, but the Arabic speaking population is still just such a huge and vibrant, important part to our global society that trying to understand these, and specifically here we were looking at sentiment analysis of social media posts, right? And because whether you're, it's been an issue, I wear a lot of hats, right? I partner with a lot of people in the Peace Studies Institute at Notre Dame. As introduced, I'm also an Air Force officer in the reserves for the Department of Defense. So, how to predict and prevent violence is something both on my civilian and on the military side. So if we do those predictions wrong, right? And so if we think, oh, we see that there's uprising and there may be violence in this part of the world. And like I said, we don't, the Arabic interpretations and the NLP is not as robust as it should be. This is something we want to do better, right? We don't want to get it wrong. We don't want to make assumptions, that lead to more violence. And we want to make sure that we're understanding when we hopefully can intervene and reduce violence. So this is something we've been working on. A lot of, you can see sort of different tools, the degree that they felt it was positive. So manual means we had human readers, so we're validating these against expert Arabic readers, not only ourselves, but data sets that have already been read and classified that are globally available. And so those are cited. This paper is submitted. It is not in press yet, but I'm happy to send a pre-draft to anybody that's interested in this particular one. This evaluates a number of the tools. You'll notice that not all tools, one of the challenges we're having with sensitivity analysis is a lot of tools are either binary, positive or negative. They have three options, tertiary, so they've got positive, neutral, and negative, and then some of them have 5, right? So very positive, slightly positive, neutral, et cetera. And there's the normalization schemes are not kind of globally agreed upon. So in the paper, we're also discussed that quite a bit as far as how do we normalize, how do we get to these, what is socially, psychologically, if we're going to do sentiment, what's a good compromise? Should it be binary? Should it be a 5-point scale? That sort of a thing. And then because we're on different scales, we tried different ways in the paper of how we would weight things in terms of positivity and negativity if there's no neutral. And some of that we go into definition and description of how we do weighted kappa scores, so that folks can look into that. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here to look at the tools, understand them, not just in English, but to understand for our global community that these are tools we need to be able to understand. And we get into the paper also. There's some of these where you can run it after it's been translated, right? And so there's a whole world in NLP of just a translator itself. So you'll run into folks that say, look, I am an NLP expert. And you're like, great, can you help me classify? And they're really an expert in just the translation, which is so crucial. But another subdomain within inside NLP for these folks that are absolute experts in the translation side of things. Okay, one more, click back. Now I'm going to this is the wrap-up project that I'm going to finish with for NLP, specifically an event prediction or event classification, so we can do understanding and hopefully eventually prediction so we can intervene. So Professor Nestor Videja, he started this process, this project. I was brought in once he realized that the scope and the scale and to get really good statistical numbers was going to require either 10 students reading nonstop for the next 30 years or 100 students, reading for the next 3 years nonstop. And then the other challenge with doing a lot of that manual is if the definitions were to change or triggers were to be added, then you need to either start all over if you change the definitions, or you need, another army every time you want to add in another trigger definition. So specifically for any of the folks on the call here that are interested in peace studies and understanding violence and violence prevention, there's sort of these well understood long-term risk factors. And so this experts have been looking at for years. Ernesto has published on this in depth himself. For sort of what these long-term risk factors that might lead to instability and violence in a particular country, in a particular group. This specific project's trying to say, okay, given these known sort of risk factors in the environment, then we have specific events. And how does the scheduling or the occurrence or the co-concurrence of these events correlate to causality potential of mass killings? Right. And so we're really looking at the triggers themselves that are layered on top of these long-term risk factors. So you have these and then there was a coup or conflict spilled over across a boundary or there was a riot, et cetera. So we've got 9 triggers that we're working through specifically. Some are specific in terms of, a very unique thing like a coup. Other triggers are protests, which are more generic, and more generic yet, we have like change in political control. Exactly, what does that mean? So some of the definitions are somewhat accordion, which make NLP more challenging. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of minutes. But this is the project that we've been working on to give you an idea of sort of the space. So, okay, which mass killings are you going to look at? So we're going to jump deep into the quant, right? So we're saying, okay, there's a dependent variable space that we want to look at, which is the number of mass killing events. So that's the dependent. The mass killing event did happen. We're looking at about a 29-year span, and we're looking at 69 countries. A couple of countries had more than one killing event during that time span. So we've got 74 mass killings. And mass killings are defined within a certain number of killings outside of the standard deviation for that country. So there's a little bit of variability there. We don't have time to go deep into the definition of how the qualification of a mass killing, but we can send information in that regard to those who are interested. So if you do the quick summary there, we studied 2 years prior. So we kind of the statistical method, and I'll have this on the next slide, is called ECA. And we'll talk about that, but that looks at the window 2 years prior, and we look at actually 24 months. So we look at each month. Did this event occur in that month? And then we can do the longitudinal causality with a temporal metric there. So if you're actually, though, for me on the NLP side, for my team, we're like, okay, what number of articles are we looking at here? How many do you want me to classify? What are we talking about? What do we need to understand with the data set? So we've got 74 mass killing events, 2-year window prior. So event years, I've got about 148. We've already pulled down and started processing all the protest triggers for the dependent variable space, and there were 111,000 articles. right? Not something the students can read. He's to get through some of the rate right now for about 4 students per trigger is about 5,000 to 10,000 a semester. So for this one, he'd need 4 or 5 students for anywhere from 10 to 20 years to get that trigger done, right? So reading through just on the dependent variable was going to be too many, right? Now, the full research space, which we have not done yet, this is the holy grail of really doing a statistical, is looking at also the null space, right? So the null space means, what about when these triggers happen, these events happened, but the killing event did not, right? And until we do that analysis, there's always going to be this standard deviation of error in the, again, we'll talk a little bit about the ECA, but actually being able to show statistical causality, we also have to look at the null space. Right. So if you were to do an upper bound estimate, we have not tried to pull all of the null space down yet. And so most of this is licensed through our licensing and relationships that we have with LexisNexis. But the upper bound, if we go through United Nations countries, there's currently 193 of them. At 29 years, then we've got actually 5,000, almost 5,600 event years. At the same number of articles per event year, we'd be around 4 million articles. Now, obviously, that's an upper bound estimate. Not all the little countries are going to have nearly as many articles. They just don't necessarily have as much going on necessarily. Not always true. Some of them have a whole lot of protest, even in small countries, but just won't have as many articles that we have to look through on the null space because there's just not many articles as our number of articles produced. Sorry, go back. And so that's for one trigger. As I mentioned, and we won't have time here to in depth go through all of them, but that's about 4 million articles. There'll be more protests because they're more generic than there will be coups. We've seen that already. We've pulled down dependent variables for all of those other 8 triggers. Protest is one of the bigger ones, but they range from about 10,000 to about 100,000. So within that sort of order of magnitude. So if our biggest one, is around 4 million, and that scales down to about 1. We've got about 10 of these. We're still thinking we're in that sort of, we're going to have to do at least 1 million articles of, classification, potentially larger as we go forward and broaden that out. But that's sort of our space, 1 million articles, maybe up to like 10 million, but definitely we need to be prepared to do 1 million. So right now we're working in the 100,000 some odd range as we're going through before we pull in the null space. Okay. So this is what it looked like early on in the pilot. They just had human readers. And so they go to the web portal. Students were able to get through across multiple triggers, about a 10K a semester. They manually coded them. And again, this is coding from a event prediction coding, not in a software engineering coding. So they would go in and say, yes, this article does have a protest event, or no, this article does not. They would then categorize and link, this month had a particular one, and then with that temporal map, you can think of a big matrix of all the months and killing events, and either a 0 or 1, it did or did not have the killing event. They run this through the statistical method. It's called event coincident analysis. We did not create event coincident analysis, although this is new, using it more broadly in the social sciences. It's primarily been used trying to look at causality in environmental situations. So this is kind of a little bit of the secret sauce, although we do have a paper out already on this as far as the workflow itself earlier this summer. But the actual results of the ECA are still ongoing, and especially since we're still just working in the dependent variable space. So it's very limited, the number of articles. They couldn't go, in depth in finding all of these. So we started moving about a year ago into this more, sorry, I kind of keep wanting to slide my cursor and it forwards my slide deck. So we moved into this this automated fashion so that we can take 10 million articles, eventually we can machine code them. We started with Petrarch and looking at neural nets. SVM seemed to be the best for us. And then we have a validation loop where we keep kind of coming back to human languages and dictionaries, where the human dictionary defines again what that trigger event looks like, and then the human readers can keep validating that. Once we've machine coded and we focus primarily on the yeses, everything starts out as a no, the event not happening in the matrix for ECA. So we're going out kind of needle in a haystack trying to find the events that do happen, right? And so once we find and we think, yes, we think we found an article, then it goes back into the queue for a spot check of human readers. So the machine coding reduces all the work of doing a whole bunch of extra negatives for all the students, because it is primarily the articles are negative by and large, not having it. And then when we do find a positive, then we don't do all right now, all the humans, but we spot check them to keep working on our accuracy of finding those. A lot of visualizations, things that we need to do when you're processing 100,000 articles and you can't really read them. You kind of know how your tools work, but simple things like word clouds, like this was an early one where we were like, wow, this is weird. A bunch of our positives have this thing called raw, right? Why is the word raw? Is this just really, an interesting, stuff but no, it turned out, students we were classifying all these, but raw just was in a whole bunch of News Digests were in some of these articles. And sure enough, the News Digest had this word raw coming in because it was kind of like this raw text or whatnot that was coming from multiple other places. And so we're like, oh, this is a problem. We got to fix all these News Digests. But again, you don't have time to physically read 100,000 articles. So you've got to have ways to visualize the NLP. And so these are sort of old school, you say word clouds, so they're 20 years old, but students now get so excited about the machine learning and classifying, et cetera, that they're not used to even doing this basic tools to look at things like a word cloud or like a distribution of word count. Right? They also would have found that it's like, hey, almost all the articles are here, but what are you doing with these news articles that are, 10 times as many words or that sort of thing? What's going on there? Are those articles we still want in? Are they going to throw things off? And again, a lot of that in this particular case was these News Digests that came out, under the same sort of search parameters in LexisNexis, and they were hitting positive, but they had so much other stuff in the article that, that little protest that was a yes also wound up with 30 other news article things that day that weren't related, and it was really hurting our accuracy, right? Because it was classified as a yes event, but then it had all these other words that also mapped to no events. And so the News Digests were hurting. But doing these simple analysis up front that we can all kind of visually see before you get into the SVM and let alone neural networks to kind of get closer and closer to black box, you want to try and do the linguistics visual processing as much as possible. Similar here is visualizing this. So if you're going to use SVMs, as we were doing, again, SVMs traditionally have done a better job on small training sets. And again, because we don't already have 100,000 classified articles, if we did, we wouldn't have to, move forward with this. We only have a few hundred, especially on the positives, right? We have a whole bunch of negative classified articles, but to get a positive event found article, we don't have large training sets. It might be, so for protests, we have like 200 articles we're training on, and we want to turn around and we want to classify 100,000 articles, right? So SVMs traditionally have done better with small training sets. May not get the ultimate highest accuracy if you have a big training set and you can use a neural network, but we don't have a big training set. I don't have 100 students to go ahead and read the 100,000 articles up front. Right, so the SVMs have worked better for us. Again, we get so many questions saying, show us everything you've done with the neural nets and with BERT. So we're going to have to more robustly do all the BERT anyway, just to answer like reviewer questions because neural nets are so hot right now. But the SVMs for our small training set so far have looked pretty good for us. So this sort of looks like that, right? So we get a corpus in development where we're trying to actually train it. We get 500 articles, about 200 positives, 300 negatives. We have lots and lots of negatives. We don't want to overload it with negatives. So we do a training set of about 500. We do a visualization first now. We've added that step in because the students were realizing getting all these weird things in the back end black box. So we do visualize the corpus. Then we do some pre-processing, right? For those who are familiar, we lemmatize and get, tokenize and get, various other factors of the process the text before we put it in, encode it, pull out any other features. Then we train the SVM. Then we have our inference engine. Okay, that can kind of we can keep tuning the hyperparameters to improve that. And then once we have that trained SVM, we can then take our 100,000 unclassified articles. We process that, through a similar, but, it's not a feedback because they're not trained. We process that, and then we ultimately, in the bottom right there, end up with our classification results. What has actually been classified? Which of these 100,000 articles had protest triggers in them? and what was our accuracy. That way we go through a human loop and we spot check and see, we thought these 5,000 articles all had protests, and when we sample from them to see what the students think. We have students sampling those right now, almost all fall as we go through that. This gives you an idea of kind of where we're at per percentages. It kind of makes sense. If it's hard for a human to read for an SVM, it oftentimes is also hard for a computer to figure it out. Protests, so you do a bunch of parameter tuning for those who haven't used SVMs before. So test size is just the ratio of how much of your training, the data you've got labeled that you've actually used. Oh, I'm 1 minute over. So before Matt pulls me, this is, I think, my last slide, Matt. So I'm going to finish this in 10 seconds and stop. Gives you an idea how you do the hyperparameter tuning. You get about, our best numbers for protests are in the 80s, coups, which are much, cleaner in terms of our students read them better and the machine reads them better. We get higher. We're, 95% accurate in predicting coups, in classifying coups correctly. And then this change in political control is CPC. That's more nebulous. And sure enough, students, when students have trouble, we have them do cross-coder correlations to see if they agree. So we also see similar, this is all the SVM sort of thing, though. Gives you an idea of different types of events, challenges in the classification. Whew, sorry, 1 minute over, Matt. Apologize. Questions?
No problem at all. That was fascinating. Yeah, we do have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions while folks think about that. One thing that I'd love your thoughts on, I was in a workshop recently with Peter Dodds from UVM, and they do a lot of NLP stuff as well. And, I share your view that there's a nice cycle to doing analytics and then doing generative methods like an agent-based model to test your hypotheses given what you've seen from the analytics. But Peter was a little hesitant about moving to generative methods very quickly because he's of the opinion that we still need better ways of measuring social systems, essentially. We still need to develop our microscope, so to speak. And so I'm curious, do you think NLP is getting there? Is it there? Can we actually start to characterize social dynamics with these sorts of tools and techniques, given the ubiquity of news feeds and things like that? Or do you think there's still quite a bit to do?
Yeah, I think to Peter's point, there's quite a bit to do, but there's quite a bit to do in our both sides of the equation, right? Some models are helpful, all models are wrong. I would say it's the same for your machine learning kernels. Some machine learning kernels or the inference engines, the way you develop them, they're useful, but they're still, maybe likely, wrong. So I would be hesitant to say, let's not do generative or let's not figure out combining because we don't have the perfect tool on the machine learning or on the agent-based modeling side. I don't know that we'll ever have it perfect. We've got really smart people doing decades of agent-based modeling and machine learning, and they're still not perfect. So I'd be hesitant to wait to say, well, let's not try a generative where we're doing some analysis on both sides and then doing a feedback loop. We're doing some machine learning and it feeds back to our agent-based model. Agent-based model gives us ideas for what to look for in our machine learning training set. I think we need to try it, right? I think some people are, and yes, it's going to be full of, there's a certain, the straight mathematician would say, well, if you take X number of unknown variables and problems here and you multiply them here, we just got something we statistically can't analyze. And I don't argue that. I don't argue the math for there, but I think to say we're not going to try it at all and see if we can't at least heuristically reduce the variable space on both sides, the places where we're not confident in our microscope or social science, to kind of just start with simple models and that generatively work in a loop with a machine learning on some of our better understood. I think that's a good place to start. I think throwing it at super complex systems that are already, all kinds of statistical, variability and opportunities for, the complexity to get out of control numerically, that's not where we obviously want to start. But I think there's certainly opportunities for simple systems to do more validation of this.
I certainly agree with you, and I suspect I'm overstating his position, but it was an interesting perspective that I hadn't heard articulated before. other questions or comments folks have? Going once, going twice.
Everybody's tired after a late election night.
Matt, I've got one question.
Yeah.
Sure.
Milton here. Just wondering your sense, Paul, about like how much of what you're using is kind of largely off the shelf using SVM and NLP components versus things you're having to invest a lot of time in developing and refining to for your particular projects.
Yeah. So off the shelf, so most of the SVM, and in some regards, as we move, we're going to robustly do more tools to compare SVMs for this specific use case with some of the neural nets and TensorFlow. Almost everything that we've used on the SVMs, right, is just coming out of, the generally available Python libraries. So no particular, the tools are fairly robust there as far as generating an inference engine in the kernel. Sentiment analysis a little bit different. I'm specifically talking about the SVM and the classification. Sentiment analysis sort of all over the place. Bader, so some of these things that might be accessible open source. We found that some of the commercial cloud-based sentiment analysis, Google's tools and Amazon's tools seem to be significantly better. Now, their inference engines may have been trained on, we say may, but we know on really, really large labeled data sets because they have really, really large labeled data sets. So not that surprising that they're inference engines, but it's not open source. As a researcher, we compare, we want to know, but I'd also like to have, more access to things like that are open my students can play with, like scikit-learn, et cetera. If you're ultimately in production, want to do some of these, I think you really have to look at some of the commercial where the inference engine's already been built by a company that had massive amounts of data. If, on the other hand, you're going to create your own kernels, I think any of the open source tools are fine because you're not benefiting from an already trained on a massive amount of data kernel that's available in the public sector. The only other thing I would say that we do find in tools that we're going to have to be doing some smithing, and we're going to be writing a grant proposal around, the visualization is sort of spotty still for how we do this. And in fact, we were super excited and we've started using Google open sourced LIT, L-I-T. So if you search for it, it's a new project on GitHub that Google had internally been using to try and make sense of some of these inference engines and kernels and trying to figure out confusion matrix. And for that, believe it or not, that's a real thing. For those that think it's just I just think it's a fun name, and it's exactly trying to help understand some of the confusion, some of the data when you're doing these machine learning, but how to visualize those, how to see things. It's a cool tool. It's kind of like a JavaScript engine sitting behind a data ingestion, so you can visualize better what's going on. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to develop tools that help us look at the text. To me, it's text data. Those can use other types of data also before kind of the pre-processing, and then kind of at every stage of the process, because so much of it is still black box. And especially if we've got junior people, that's common in research where they're getting up to speed. The visualization tools need some advancement. We're going to try and contribute in the coming year to the open source Google Lit project. So that's the tool I think if anybody wanted to go jump in, go help out in one of these open source kind of pre-processing visualization. The general creating the kernel and the math is pretty well done, I think, in some of the scikit-learn tools. But I think the visualization, pre-processing, and understanding tools need a little more work.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Okay, so I just wanted to make one comment, and that is the distinctions between building an explanatory model or a model to explain, some event like theory building versus machine learning. I see some distinction between those two operations, particularly machine learning. Especially using NLP, corresponds with what sociologists call grounded theory approach. So basically, you don't make any assumptions about things. You start out, most of the time, you start out with an unsupervised learning approach, and then you kind of build your supervised model on that. So from what I heard you discuss today, Paul, I kind of see that you're trying to do the traditional statistical modeling approach using a machine learning technique, and I just want to make I want to hear your comment about that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is definitely the supervised learning where we are kind of setting up the framework for how we set our definitions, et cetera. It's not unsupervised. Unsupervised, you still have to be careful with the bias. Ultimately, you still have to select data, et cetera. I think there's a lot of excitement in unsupervised. I personally still struggle to see where there are some biases somewhat in the unsupervised learning to figure out the outcomes and to see what data you feed into it and that sort of a thing. So I'm not comfortable yet moving to unsupervised. Whereas I feel like in supervised, yes, we already have we've pulled the data, we know exactly what data we're trying to train it on, that sort of a thing. And so I would agree with you that that subtle difference should be understood by folks, in a better way. But yeah, definitely we're on the supervised where it's, we're sort of controlling our dependent variables and the null space and how we learn upon those with specific definitions versus a broad brush unsupervised across millions of articles looking for, some sort of correlation. Maybe it's not the events, like we've defined the events, right? We've supervised this. This is exactly what we want them to classify versus saying, we know these mass killings happened. You unsupervised learning, come back and tell us which articles all correlated with this in reverse, which would be cool and exciting because it turns out could be none of those triggering events. It's always when, it rains 3 weeks before, and we just didn't catch that in the article. But I think the unsupervised would be really cool. Unsupervised also requires a broader capability and subtly to make sure you're still not doing the bias. But I agree that there's important differentiation there. And we're definitely doing supervised, sort of statistical guided at this point.